I'm Mary Lyons, and I am the Wealth Woman.
And I'm Eric Alexander from Benchmark Income Group.
And this is the Big Wealth Podcast.
Everything you've ever been taught about money is wrong.
But don't worry, we're here to help.
On this podcast, we'll use the same tools you already know to actually help set you free.
Free to do what you want with your time, with your money, and with your energy. Free to live your life the way you have dreamt about.
So we're going to talk about wealth knowledge, personal reflections, and the financial industry news of the day.
Welcome to the Big Wealth Podcast. Today we have an interesting topic that will be led by our very own Eric Alexander. Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, we kind of had this sort of nerdy concept or nerdy question the other day of how long have mutual funds actually been around, and like what is sort of the history of the market on that side of it? Because I think whenever we talk to clients, it seems like mutual funds have been around forever. Like, what do you invest in? I don't know, mutual funds, right? As if it's always been a thing. And we kind of had that, has it really always been a thing? And so in a very short little research project, we kind of looked at that.
Yeah, the answer is a little bit of yes and a little bit of no, and we'll go into that in more detail. So Eric,
Right.
When did mutual funds come into existence?
So the very first one was from a Dutch guy, and I'm not going to butcher his name, but it was in 1774, and it was the very first sort of mutual fund. And the tagline they gave to it was sort of unity through strength, and sort of this idea of sort of sharing risk across or pooling risk across sort of wider pool, right? I'm not sure if you can say pooling risk across a wider pool, but there you go. So it's stretching out your risk, right?
It's okay.
And then really it didn't do much. I mean, there's a couple of other countries that sort of introduced one or two here along the way, but that was kind of it. And all the way up until I think 1924 was the next sort of big launch of a mutual fund, but that didn't actually get implemented into the market until 28. So that was kind of the first round of that. And that was by what eventually became MFS Investment Management was sort of that first one that got implemented there. And
it's kind of like the electric car. It's been around for a long time, but
right.
No one used them or produced them for quite some time.
Yeah. I mean, and I think there's thousands of reasons for that one, but in 29, it started to get a little bit of traction. There were 19 mutual funds, open-end mutual funds in 1929, and then the Great Depression hit, and a lot of that everybody kind of lost their sort of taste for it.
Right.
And then few more decades went by. In 1950, we finally had maybe a quorum, if that's what you want to call it. There were 100. In 1950, there were about 100, so killing it. And it grew by a number of them started to get created at that point. So another 50 got introduced over the next decade. And then it kind of meandered along until the kind of late 60s, early 70s. And so you start out with that kind of corpus of 100. And now today there's, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 14,000 mutual funds.
Yeah, that's a big jump. So, I think that a couple of things happened that maybe created a little space for mutual funds to gain popularity. But when you start really thinking through it, I think there's some things that happened that made sense because the 401k came into existence in about 1978. And so when you look at the fact that mutual funds existed prior to that, they really didn't take off. And when you think about what a mutual fund really is, it's a bucket of stocks, bonds, other investments. And so when you give your money to a mutual fund, you're able to get diversification in a way that people weren't able to get when they were looking at a stock portfolio. Because if they wanted to have a truly diversified portfolio, it really required a certain amount of money that not all Americans had to be able to invest. Right. And so the mutual fund made that possible. But when you think about it, most people weren't really looking for that until pensions started to go away and employers started releasing the 401k saying, okay, well, now you have to invest. And what can you invest in? But this bucket of funds and mutual funds at that point.
Yeah. And I think there's a certain amount of psychology that goes into that as well. Of if I've got to pick the one fund or the two funds or the three funds that I'm going to really invest in, the companies, whether it's Apple or Google or GE or whatever it was at the time, right? That's a pretty tall order, right? That's how much have I researched GE? Do I like GE? Do I like IBM? Like you're really kind of having to dig into that and
do a bunch of work.
you're doing a bunch of work, and are you really qualified for that? Do I really know enough about this company to invest in? But if I've got a mutual fund where I'm spreading my risk across 100 or 200 different stocks and bonds, well, then I think it takes some of the fear out, because I don't
Right.
have to win on any one of them.
Well, you don't have to be the expert because you've deferred that to someone else who's picking the basket of funds that you're putting your money into at that point in time. So what was the difference between like early 80s? What percentage of households in the early 80s actually had mutual funds versus now?
So in the early 80s, I think 1980 was the stat I saw, 5.7% of households actually owned a mutual fund in the early 1980s. And today, or as of 2019 anyway, it's almost 50%, 46.4.
Wow.
And so it's over a really, really short span of time, historically anyway, over 40 years, I guess, right? We've grown by quite a bit as far as the adoption rate of mutual funds. So it's pretty,
well, and it makes sense, right? Because you get used to them in your 401k, and then you're looking for them if you ever do a rollover to an IRA, and it allows you to get a true diversification, right? When you think about it, though, it's interesting to see what's happening right now, because there are other types of investments that have evolved or that are evolving, because there's ETFs now.
Right.
And then with certain software programs, you can acquire partial shares of individual stocks so that you don't have to buy the entirety of that stock. So you can get to a diversified portfolio even outside of mutual funds now, can't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the famous story of Berkshire Hathaway's, right? Like who has enough money to buy one share of Berkshire A? Right? So, you go, well, I want 1.1% of Berkshire A or something like that, right? And so that, because you don't have the leverage up to go get it. Most mutual fund, initial funds, I mean, you could get one started with $1,000, $1,500.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need millions of dollars to be a mutual fund investor.
Right. So what I think is really interesting about this, and there's I think the history in and of itself is kind of fascinating, just to see how things evolve and when people decide to get on that bandwagon, right? There's usually a trigger. You think about what's happening now, and I'm going to go back to the electric car, right? There's somebody who made them really exciting, and that coincided with the time period where there's a lot of pressure environmentally, right? And then also price is a factor. And so I think we start to see that evolving. And when you think about what happened with the mutual fund situation, it's kind of the same, right? There is a change that occurred that triggered, hey, wait, now we're looking for a new solution. And what I think is really interesting is that, and this is where I'm going with that, is there is always a trigger point that creates a moment in time that people start looking for a new solution. And I actually think that that's happening right now from a big picture planning perspective, because what's happening right now is that everyone who's had mutual funds, stocks, bonds, commodities, diversified portfolios, ETFs, partial shares, all that sort of thing, as they begin retiring, they're asking a different question, because as you're young and you're working, it's all about, I need to drive rate of return. I need net worth. There's ego that gets wrapped up in that. But what we've seen is that as people are retiring, now if you look at where a lot of the research is focused in our industry, it's what can you safely spend? How can you make sure that you don't run out of money? And so there's this moment in time where kind of the accepted ways of doing things, people are looking at those and saying, but wait a minute, is this really the best way to get what I want? And that makes me happy, because I think that it is always good to question the status quo. There's a little bit of a rebel in me, maybe somewhere. I say that as a complete and utter rule follower, but there are some things I still want to know, why is the rule in place? But, I think this is kind of the case, because sometimes I feel like what happens as we're talking to our clients is there's this sort of familiarity that gets mistaken for knowledge. And I think I'm going to keep using the car examples. I'm just rolling with that today. But like, I think about my car. I know how to drive a car. I know how to put gas in it. I know how to, make sure that, if the check engine light comes on, I know there's something wrong with it. But I definitely shouldn't be building my own car. I think that would be disastrous. And I certainly shouldn't even be doing my own maintenance, because that's not a skill set that I have. And so while I'm very familiar with cars, I can't really say that I know that much about them. And I think sometimes that happens in the world of investment specifically, but also in the broader world of, okay, what should I be doing financially, right?
Right. Well, that's the thing. Right. I remember, my first gig, right? You walk in, you got your badge and your computer, and you're off to the races, right? And then the next sheet of paper that gets pushed in front of you is, hey, you should save some money. And if you save some money, we'll give you some money of our own, right? The company opens up
Right.
401,
Right.
right? And so you're like, okay, that sounds like a good
I'll
deal.
do that.
And you phone a friend, right? And as from the whole game show, you phone a friend. All right, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're looking left and right, and they're like, well, I'm putting all my money here, and we're gonna go. We bought these mutual funds because I don't know anything about Coca-Cola or IBM or GE, and so I'm gonna hire Bob, the mutual fund manager, to go manage my portfolio. And they're like, okay, I've offloaded that decision to the mutual fund manager. And I've phoned a friend on what everybody else around me is doing, because these guys all seem smart. These girls all seem smart. So this is what
they're
I'm gonna do.
engineers. They had to get through college.
Right.
They had difficult degrees. They must know something about it.
Right. But just to your example about your car, right? I think the surgeon that works on my mouth is really, really a smart guy, but I don't want him working on my car. Like there's
Right.
different realms of knowledge, right?
Well, I also don't want someone that read some books or took some online courses doing surgery on my mouth either. Like, I
Right.
really would like someone who is a true professional doing that. I want my attorney handling anything legal. I want my doctor handling that. I don't want to get my medical advice from TikTok. That's
Right.
I don't think that's where I should be getting my advice.
But I think that's where we go. And your phrase that sort of it's like an earworm in my brain over the last few months is sort of, are you living life by design or by default? Sort of kind of trickles around in my brain and bounces around, right? But I think it's that, okay, now what? Right. And so we go do the thing, we watch our 401k get bigger, and we're doing all the stuff that all of our peers are doing, right? Was it the Joseph Campbell thing? You're the average of the 5 people you hang around with the most, right? I think it was Joseph Campbell. And you get to retirement, and then all your friends are gone. Like there's no other people in your house going, all right, how are we paying these bills? And so you're like, okay, great, I'm retiring. Now what? Like we don't have the question in our brain about now what do we do until we get there, unless somebody else has implanted the idea.
We're dealing with the problem, I think, so frequently that is the problem that is most immediate, that's right in front of our face, as opposed to thinking long-term and making decisions very differently. You said something a minute ago that really just like got a wheel spinning, I think, in my head. And I think you used the word familiar, right? Which I had said a moment ago, but in my head, it sort of changed into comfortable. Right? We as humans like to stay in our comfort zone. We don't like to do things that make us uncomfortable. And so one of the ways that we figure out what is comfortable is that we look around and we crowdsource information, right? I mean, that is a great way to buy a pair of joggers because you know how they're going to hit your leg, what someone's weight height ratio might be, how the fabric felt, that kind of stuff. But ultimately buying a pair of joggers is a pretty simple decision. And I think a lot of times
right, you just trade it.
You just return it, right? Yeah, you just return it and it's no big deal if the reviews didn't match what you were expecting. And a lot of times you feel good, right? But when it comes down to it, I think it is so much harder to decide which information is credible and what financial path you should be taking because everybody has an opinion. Right. And the way we figure out our comfort level is we say, well, what's my neighbor doing? What did my parents do? What's my brother doing? Okay, well, what is my friend doing? And when all of them give you an answer that sounds kind of the same, it's easy to fall into this place of familiarity, comfort, complacency of, okay, I guess that's what I should do because somebody else vetted it. And, I did a yoga retreat with Sonia Azad, who we had as a guest not too long ago. And she said, you need to approach this with a beginner's mind because everyone there, I think me being the exception, like hardcore yogis do yoga all the time. And I thought, well, I don't have any choice but to approach this from a beginner's mind because I am a beginner. And I think what happens so frequently is that sense of familiarity and that comfort and that complacency kills our curiosity and frequently our creativity. And so we end up with solutions that are okay, right? They may be a B in the scheme of things, or they may even be an A, but you could have an A+, right? There's a saying that I repeat often. It was repeated in my house growing up, and it will be repeated in the household that my husband and I have together now, which is good is the enemy of the great, right? If great is possible, good isn't good enough. And I think we're in this sort of space where it's like, okay, well, I can make some investments and it'll grow a little bit. And then when I retire, I'm going to have less income than I live off of now, but that's okay because maybe I've paid off my house. I don't have kids. So I'll just settle for that. And I just
It's a rationalization. It's not a design.
Right. And it goes back to, if you have the ability to change what you're doing and the time is right for it, right? We're recognizing that the fact that people don't have pensions anymore is actually creating a problem from an income perspective today. And so people are more and more starting to say, well, how do I maximize my income in this situation? And I think, when it comes down to it, you talk a lot about a concept called elephant versus rider. And I actually think this is an appropriate time to bring that in,
Sure.
right? Because you made the comment about, well, that's a rationalization, right? When I was talking just a second ago. So can you talk a little bit about that elephant rider relationship and how that plays in with the choices people make in the financial arena?
Sure. Yeah. So the idea of the elephant and the rider is sort of what some people would call the old brain and the new brain, sort of the reptilian brain versus the neocortex, right? So the elephant is sort of that inner brain, and it has no capacity for thought, or it has no capacity for words and math and sentence forming, but and it is there to keep you alive, right? It is there to make sure that we're avoiding danger. And what was the pitch anything Oren Klaff book, right? I either need to kill it, eat with it, or mate with it, kind of thing.
Right.
Like
it's
it
one
is
of those
just,
three.
It's I'm just trying to keep us out of jail and out of danger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then so it is where that gut feeling comes from. Like,
well, and that part of the brain is particularly lazy, which Oren Klaff talks a lot about in his book Pinch Anything. He talks about how it just wants to like make a decision, and if it doesn't hit one of those 3 points, it's like, get it off my plate. I'm done. I'm not needed here. I'm going back to sleep.
Right. Well, the whole brain is a miser, right? Because processing information is really taxing on the brain, right? I mean, think about going through class when I was in college. Like, I was physically tired being in class all day long.
Right.
Not mentally tired. I was physically tired because I just want to go home and go sleep, right? And so that inner part of it, and the problem with the elephant is that it's short-sighted and it's scared of everything, and it's incredibly powerful.
Right.
As far as
huge.
what's driving, right? The neocortex, sort of what they would call the new part of the brain, it's where we make decisions. It's where we rationalize stuff. It's where we form words and do math and long division.
Analysis comes from that part of the brain, right?
And it's incredibly weak. It gets tired very quickly, and it runs out of gas fast. And its job, and the problem is that the neocortex is incredibly arrogant, because the neocortex thinks it's in control of the rider. And the joke I had the other day was sort of an old Seinfeld joke. It's like, if you ever want to see the problem between the new brain and the old brain, watch some moron guy driving down the road with a mattress on the top of his car, and he's got one hand on top of it thinking,
holding it.
I got this.
I got this.
No, you don't. No, you don't. And I think that's the problem with sort of the rider and the elephant, is that the rider's looking at the world, doing math, thinking, I got this. And they're not taking into account the fact that the elephant's really driving the bus.
Well, that's a good point, right? I mean, I think it's very easy for the rider to be in control under normal daily circumstances, right? You're steering the elephant, and that gives you the perception of control. But when it comes down to it, if that elephant decides to go crazy and stampede, there is nothing the rider can do to stop it. And I think that it's really, it's kind of just fun to think about the way that works in our personal lives too, because I think especially for people who are heavily analytical, they tend to especially discount the power of the elephant, because they feel like they can compartmentalize and that sort of thing. And having done this job for 15 years or so at this point, I frequently find that some of the most emotional decision makers are the more analytical clients, because they are disconnected from how that elephant is driving them. Whereas, sometimes the more emotional clients, because they're aware of how their emotion affects things in such a strong way, tend to actually be a little more in control when they are making their decisions. Not always, but I do find that
Right.
sometimes that shows up. And,
Well,
you know,
that's that part of it. Sorry, real quick. That's the part of it of what, sorry, slightly philosophical here, but there's Carl Jung, right? Created this concept called the Jungian shadow, right? This idea of the light and the dark and sort of the darker parts of our personality versus the good side of ourselves, right? And his theory is that if you don't integrate the shadow into your personality, if you try to keep the shadow in a cave somewhere locked up, not understanding what's going on, not bringing it out to understand how it integrates, it will kill you. Like it will grow bigger and bigger and bigger, but you're not watching it. And so one day it will overtake you. Like Bill Cosby, Tiger Woods, like those guys are sort of classic examples of their shadow ate them up.
Ends up overtaking them because
And
they
so
ignore
that
it
idea,
as opposed to dealing with it. Right.
And so I think your emotional idea of if you've dealt with your emotions all your life and you know that that's part of it, you know how to manage, you know what it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say, even for me personally, I tend to have very big emotions. I feel things very deeply. I don't know that I would go so far as to describe myself as an empath, but I am definitely the type of personality that, like, someone comes in my door, if they're happy, I'm immediately happy. I'm like, why are we happy? This is amazing. Or if they walk in and, you know, they're really sad, I'm like, oh my gosh, what's happening? And my whole mood like comes down to match theirs. But what's interesting is that growing up like that, and especially in a household of people who are very analytical, it brought to my attention when the emotion was the driver over and over and over again. And so what happens now is I have the ability to say, whoa, that's emotion. What is the emotion pushing? What is the logical thing to do here? And sort of integrate the two. But it has taken a tremendous amount of work in my life to do that. But I think it's kind of the same idea from Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, right? It's not necessarily the things that come naturally to you that you end up being really good at. It's the things that you have to work for. Think Michael Jordan, right? Didn't make his varsity team and he showed us, right? But it's because he went for it. And I think this idea of the familiar versus the knowledgeable side of things is that I think that any time, and I've seen people do this as we bring concepts to the table that are new, is that sometimes people discount ideas because they don't know anyone else who's doing it yet, right? Like I remember having a conversation with somebody and they were like, well, no one's talking about this, no one's doing it. And I said, well, I personally have over 800 clients who are doing this. And they just kind of looked at me for a minute and they're like, oh, people are? And I said, yeah, I mean, I've got clients who refer to themselves as my public clients because they remember what it was like to kind of be the Lone Ranger trying to decide, like, is this actually what I should be doing? But I think this is where evidence becomes so important, right? It can't be, well, what's your opinion? What's your opinion? And I think this is something where I'm going to get a little bit on my soapbox for a minute. You can't necessarily ask your parents, what should I do? Unless your parents are sitting there with you. I still go to my parents for advice, right? I'm almost 40 and I still talk to them before I make major decisions. And I talk to my friends, right? And this is that sort of crowdsourcing that we are talking about earlier. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, my answer is always the same, which is show me. Show me the evidence that this is the right decision, whether that's financial or child rearing or, you know, any of those types of things. I think it all has to come back to, are you taking an evidence-based approach? And are you approaching your finances with a beginner's mind, right? And I think it's so key, this sort of history of mutual funds and the evolution. They've been around for a long time, but it was what, 200 plus, not quite 150 years before they made it to the US in any kind of major way. And then after that, you know, it's another 50 years before you start to see adoption, and then another 40 years before it becomes commonplace, right? It's not to say it wasn't a bad or a good idea, right? It's not that it wasn't a good idea back in the 1700s. It's that people weren't looking for it and it was weird, right? It was different. And so, you know, you think about it, there are things like that now that we look at and we're like, wait a minute, that seems different. And I think if we just approached it from the standpoint of that's different, does it apply to me, with an open and a beginner's mind, there are so many opportunities in our lives that we could take advantage of that would make the life of design versus the life of default, because we didn't really default. I said that weirdly, because we didn't really do the analysis, right?
Well, and I think that's the other challenge that I found over the years. And you talked about buying joggers or whatever, right? I think is a good example. But if I'm asking my friends, should I buy these shoes or these pants, then I feel pretty confident in their advice, right? But on big major life change, by the way, I wouldn't ask my friends if I should buy a pair of pants, but on big major life-changing decisions, should I go invest in this thing? Should I buy this new deal? Should I change my philosophy for the future? If you boil it down, your friends have one of two choices. Yes, you should do that, or no, you shouldn't.
Right.
If they say no, in turn, whether they're thinking through this consciously or not, if they, this is the reptilian brain, this is the elephant coming in, right? If I say no and my friend doesn't do this, I have lost nothing and they have lost nothing, because they're not already doing it. Right. And I preserve my friendship. They don't go off on some sort of fool errand, some sort of quixotic adventure, right? And end up tilting after windmills or anything.
Well, and they probably forget that they even asked you at some point, because once they make the decision, they've moved on, right?
But if they say yes, think reptilian brain, think I need to be part of a community or I'm all going to die, right? Historically, that's kind of how we've grown up, right?
True, historically.
Right. If I'm not part of the tribe, I'm meat for some dinosaur somewhere, right? And so this idea of, if I say yes and it goes badly, they're going to remember where I heard the advice from, right? I'm somehow leading my friend.
You get the blame.
So it's really kind of
we learn this early.
Thing.
We learn this in childhood.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it's built into, I mean, it's natural, right? And so whether they're doing the math mentally or the elephant is processing the math through, right? Kill it, eat with it, or mate with it, right? Nope. I just got to get this thing out of my way.
Right.
There's no reason why your friend would ever say, yeah, you should totally do this. This is awesome.
And I think too, there's even a step beyond this. And this is happening with a person that I was introduced to recently, where we sat down and kind of walked through, here's how this works. Here's what you could be doing. Here's how this is going to change the dynamics. Here's all of the evidence. And his response was, okay, I'm going to go back and talk to my investment guys. And so he did, and big surprise, his investment guys are like, no, you don't want to do that. That's a bad idea. And I'm like, first of all, they haven't looked at it at all. You just said, hey, what about this particular tool? Should I have this? And they said no. But secondly, if pursuing a different strategy means diverting funds that they are currently managing to a new tool so that they are no longer being compensated on that, do you really think they're going to tell you it's a good job? Like, yeah, good idea. Take money out of my pocket. That's a great idea.
You should do that all the time.
Right. So
in fact, let me introduce all my clients to these new people.
In fact, why don't I just give all your assets away? So I do think it also makes sense to ask, what does this person have to gain or lose from the decisions I make? Because there are times where, the changes that someone's considering makes a substantial difference to somebody. Because, it's protect my turf, right? That's also very crocodilian. This is mine. You can't have it. And I do think too, what happens is when we have relationships with somebody for a long period of time is that we develop a sense of trust, right? I mean, I just think like if I was sitting at a restaurant and someone came up to me and said like, this person that you've known your whole life is a secret serial killer, I'd be like, what are you talking about, weirdo? Get away from me. But if they said that and they were like, here's the pictures, right? This is happening, I would have a totally different response, right? And so, you think about that and the default is I'm going to trust the person I've known longest because that is the strongest relationally, right? Again, it's not the writer in control here. It's the elephant, right? It's safe. I don't have to do extra work. But I do think that we have to pay attention when the evidence shows up, even if it means looking at things in a very different way. And, we've had conversations before with potential clients where we say, they're like, well, this is a friend who's managing the assets. And I just find myself going, is that friend, like, are you comfortable paying them $50,000 a year to be your friend? Because what if that's what you're losing? And what if I could actually prove that that's what you're losing by doing this to protect a friendship, right? A real friend should say, let me learn this new strategy. I'm going to go over there and help you execute it, right? But that's oftentimes not how things work. But, I do think this idea of evolution is interesting. The idea of doing what's comfortable rather than going out on a limb. My mother-in-law is a therapist. She talks about people getting stuck doing what's comfortable, even though they know they're unhappy. And I definitely think there's a lot of that happening in the world of financial services right now. But I think if we close out this episode just saying, start with a beginner's mind, ask questions, right? Be humble.
Yeah.
Even things that you've explored before, explore them with different people and see if you end up with different evidence, and keep looking, right? Don't settle. There's never a time in this industry that you should have to settle. There's a bazillion financial advisors. Keep looking till you find at least one who can help you.
Right. Well, and that's that idea of I can never learn less.
Right.
And if you kind of start out the day with that, then I think you're in pretty good shape.
Right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this one, and we will see you soon.